Yeah. So this kicks off the most exciting thing that we could possibly getting into, and this is the formal agency discussion. So we've already talked about a lot of the precursor agency things. Old car, right? Fiduciary duties, the term agent, the term principal and client meaning the same thing, customer meaning something completely different. So now we get into some of the disclosure pieces and the actual categories. And hopefully after today, you'll have a much better understanding of all of the agency things that you need to know. So, quick reminder, agency is just the legal representation of one party by another party. You'll find that these slides have a lot of recurring slides in them. And that's just to revisit concepts that we talked about in the past, so you're not forgetting things. I'm not going to redo all these slides. When we see these repeats, I'm just going to remind you that you've already seen these slides, and then we'll keep moving forward. So when we're talking about an agent, understand that it's not something that you can self-appoint. You have to be hired by somebody. Somebody has to give you the authority to act on behalf of them, right? Think back to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. You don't have to have one though. And so it's the same with us. Does every person in a real estate transaction have to have an agent? The answer is absolutely not. And can you be somebody's agent without them asking you to be? The answer is absolutely not. Because remember, agents owe loyalties. Agents owe these fiduciary duties. So it's the way that we get hired. They hire us and then we are their agent. Technically, what you're called before you're representing somebody should not be real estate agent. If you want to get technical, you're a licensee or a broker, because that's just a title because of a license, not an actual position of working on behalf of somebody. Now, the other thing that I want to remind you fine folks of is the way that you should always be looking at these questions. When we say that a client hires representation, well, what we actually mean is the real estate firm. I told you that you need to think of the default relationship as a client hires a firm and us as licensees work as sub-agents of the firm. That's the best way to think of it. Remember, there are scenarios that we talked about where somebody could be hiring a broker directly, not a firm, but an actual licensee, like a sole proprietor. Okay? So it is possible, but please don't ever default to that type of question. And the reason being, it's a vastly different answer to a lot of scenarios I'm going to explain in just a minute when we get into agency agreements. The default, if we do not use the term sole proprietor, is think of the firm. Everybody good with that statement? So remember, the word sub-agent is just the agent of the agent. So if, Angie hires ABC Realty and McKinsey works for ABC Realty, right? McKinsey is a sub-agent of ABC. But when we say who is McKinsey's agent, I'm sorry, I just got confused. Angie hires ABC, McKinsey works for ABC. There we go. Angie hired ABC and McKinsey is a sub-agent of ABC. They all owe loyalties to Angie. Let me make one final statement that I made last week, and I want to make sure you understand. If Angie hires ABC, even though she's working directly with McKinsey of ABC, ABC is her agent. And let's say that every single person in this room was affiliated with ABC. We all are working for Angie. Does that statement make sense? Because we're all extensions of the firm, and the firm is the agent, not us. Let me give you a little bit of a story time to help you understand where we're going with this, okay? I want you to understand that agency and brokerage relationships have changed vastly in the past 30 years, let alone the past 60 years. So I want to explain, and I alluded to this last week, but I want to explain in greater detail. Brittany says at any given point, the agent can be substituted out. Yeah, you should think of it that way. You think of the movie The Firm every time we talk about The Firm. So we are Tom Cruise. Yeah, there you go. I want to tell you a little story time, and I want you to picture this, okay? Whether you were alive or not is irrelevant. I want you to think back to about, 40, 50 years ago. Real estate was a vastly different thing than it is today. It was very mom and poppy, okay? Like, we've got all these huge brokerage firms nowadays, Keller Williams and Cole Banker and EXP and all these. But it used to be a more mom and pop kind of business, right? Small brokerage firms working on behalf of sellers to try to sell property. And I'm going to repeat what I said. Working on behalf of sellers. And so here's what the way that this used to go. A broker would be hired by a seller who needed to sell a home. And then the broker would advertise that home and try to find that seller a buyer. Does that make sense? Well, think back to that word selling, right? What are they doing? They're in the act of selling because they're trying to find a buyer. Nothing's sold until we have a buyer. Doesn't mean that they're loyal to the buyers. In fact, they were not. Nobody was loyal to the buyers. Everybody worked on behalf of sellers. The people who sold homes had representation. That's it. And this went on for a long time. People hired brokers. Brokers found buyers. Buyers bought the homes. Brokers got paid. Everybody cool with that statement? Well, picture this. Let's say that you were an agent in this time frame and you list somebody's home for sale. And you find a buyer who you think may be interested in it. Well, you're going to show the buyer the home, right? Because that's your job. You're selling the home even though you're a listing agent. So your loyalties are to the seller, but you're going to show it because you want that home to be sold. You get nothing if it's not sold. So you show this buyer home and they say, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. This one's not for me. I was looking for something more like blank, 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 right? And they give you this description. And you know that another agent has that listing that matches that description to a T down the road. Well, here's the thing. That doesn't help you at all because if you send that business to that other agent, they sell their home, you're still sitting on the market. Everybody agree? So you've got a picture. Something changed, right? Let's say it was Patrick was the listing agent of this other home, and I'm the listing agent of the one, and I have this buyer. I pick up the phone and I say, hey, Patrick, listen, I got a thought. He's like, what's up, Seth? I said, I got a buyer who did not like my listing, but I think they'd be good for yours. And he's like, well, send them on over. And I said, well, hold up, Patrick. You know what I was thinking? Since you wouldn't have ever met these people and you're trying to sell yours, and I'd be helping you out by sending them your way, how about you give me a little something, something? And Patrick's like, what'd you have in mind? I'm like, I don't know, Patrick, like 25% or so. Patrick's like, well, I'm only paying it if this works out and this is easy, okay? And I said, that's fine, Patrick, that's fine. Let's agree on that. So I send this business over to Patrick. And Patrick works with these people and they buy his house. And so he just cuts me a check. He's like, hey, Seth, I would have never sold it without you. Happy to pay this 25%. Like, if this ever works out again, we'll do it in the future. I say, great, Patrick, sounds good. Well, that's called a referral fee. And so it was a relatively newer concept at one point, but this picked up, okay? This started going. Well, as time went on, let's say that I kept doing this, and there was another listing, and Brandy, okay, Brandy's a listing agent. I'm just picking people on my screen. Brandy's a listing agent for another property. And I call up Brandy. I say, Brandy, you know this referral thing that's been going on? I got somebody I think would be perfect for your listing, Brandy. And she says, yeah, I've done a couple of these, Seth. Hey, listen, let me run something by you. And I said, what you got, Brandy? And she says, referrals are great and all, but I'm really busy. It sucks to me that, like, I have to stop what I'm doing. I have to show this home. I have to put this all together, and then I have to pay this chunk of money. She's like, I got an idea. I said, what's that? She said, how about you come by my office, and I'll give you the keys, and you take this person to go see this house. And if they want to put an offer in on it, Seth, you write it up. We'll tag team this together, and instead of 25%, I'll give you half. And I said, huh. Okay. Yeah, Brandy, that's great. We can do that. So I think there's more than one Stephanie. I'm seeing a Stephanie on my screen. Stephanie, right in front of the blinds. You know, are you seeing me? Yeah, you. Yes, you, Stephanie. Yes. So Stephanie is a buyer. Okay. So Stephanie, I showed Stephanie my listing. She didn't like it. So I was going to show her Brandy's listing, right? Because Brandy's given this new thing. So Stephanie is my buyer. And I said, well, Stephanie, great. We're going to go see this other home that Brandy has listed, okay? And she says, great. So this was a different time. Stephanie's in my car. We stopped at McDonald's and got coffee for 20 cents, right? And I got her a coffee for 20 cents. I got me a coffee for 20 cents. We're chit-chatting. I'm talking to Stephanie about her kids, telling her how pretty this house is, right? Telling her about Brandy, the listing agent. And we drive over to Brandy's office. We get the keys. And then we drive over to this house and we show it. And there's a sign in the yard with Brandy's face on it. And we look around and Stephanie loves it. And Stephanie wants to put an offer in. So I draft up an offer and I send it over to Brandy and we get her under contract and Stephanie buys the house. Everybody still following along here? So let me ask you a very important question. Who does Brandy work for?
The seller.
The seller. Let me ask you an even more important question. Who do I work for?
Not sure. The seller.
Seller.
Adult diapers.
I love that answer. It's the seller. Folks, buyers didn't have representation at this time. Every agent that existed represented sellers. Everyone. So I worked for Brandy's seller. But let me ask you a very, very specific question. If Stephanie was in my car and I was talking to her about her family and buying her coffee and taking her to a house listed by somebody else, who did Stephanie think I worked for? Her. That is what we call implied agency. My actions suggested to Stephanie that I was her agent, but there was no buyer representation. Well, folks, this happened a lot. The buyers were confused. The agents were confused. Because historically, we all represented the seller. But now we started working more directly with buyers and helping them buy homes for sellers we had never met. So everybody had no idea. It was one thing when you met the seller and you were hired by the seller. You knew who your loyalties were when you were showing the buyer that house. But when I never met the seller, I didn't know the seller's name. All I knew was that Brandy gave me the keys to go see this house. I got confused too. A lot of people did. Ann says, what time period was it when this began to shift? Folks, buyer agency was invented formally in 1996. Which, by the way, doesn't sound that long ago to some of us. It was. It was almost 30 years ago.
So let me ask you a question. So implied agency was just something that happened back then. That's not anything we need to worry about now.
Oh, sweet baby Jesus. Of course you do. Uh-huh. Hang tight. 1996 is not test-worthy. Excellent question. You do not need to know that buyer agency was invented in 1996. Absolutely. Let me explain this, okay? There was a huge class action lawsuit that happened in like Michigan or somewhere like that. It was called the Adena lawsuit. If you look it up, you can Google it. It's very hard to find though if you don't like type in the words exactly right. But here's what happened. This exact thing where a buyer bought a house and was told certain things about the house, like it had an irrigation system, like it had knew this, and it didn't. And after she bought the house, she's like, well, why would my agent lie to me? And somebody's like, that wasn't your agent. You don't have representation. But she thought she had an agent. And so she went to an attorney. Most attorneys wouldn't touch it. But then one attorney was like, you know what? I think there's a lot of this crap happening. And they filed this huge class action lawsuit. And it was hundreds of millions of dollars that this firm had to pay out. And the federal government caught wind of this. Folks, you have to understand, most states have their own real estate commission at the time. The real estate commissions have been around since like the 1950s. And so the federal government said, y'all need to fix this or we will. So here's my question to you. How do you fix the issue of a buyer not having representation but thinking they have representation? Tell them or
Agreements.
Say it again.
Agreements. Disclosure.
Agreements. These are good answers, but let's start with something vastly important. You've got to create buyer agency. It wasn't a thing. So we had to invent it. We said everybody's sharing money anyway. Everybody's kind of acting like they're a buyer's agent. Let's just give buyers representation. And so the world changed. And here's why I'm telling you all this. Twofold. So you can understand these relationships, but also so you can understand one other very important thing. Our loyalties have nothing to do with who's paying us. Zero. Because picture this. Let me fix my chair here. There we go. Because the seller was the one paying everybody in these relationships. And when we created buyer agency, it didn't look any different than what we've been doing. It just finally gave somebody some protection. Now the buyer had representation. So it was very common for the listing agent to still charge the seller 6%, and then they would share 3% with a cooperating buyer's agent. The seller is paying the buyer's agent. But that does not dictate loyalties. Does that make sense for everybody? Just because you're getting paid from the listing agent and or the seller, they're your enemy, which is kind of funny. No other industry would that make any sense, right? Can you, and I hate to be the guy who always goes to football analogies, but can you imagine the Panthers paying the Green Bay Packers quarterback, right? That doesn't make any sense. But that's how we do it. So it is not about compensation. That's true, CJ. Right? Kind of. It's not about compensation, okay? That is a very important thing to understand. And you've got to realize that sometimes your actions could create agency. Y'all cold-blooded. So implied agency is still a thing. And let me explain a realistic way that you have to understand this in North Carolina. We're going to get into some disclosure rules in just a second. It is a requirement in North Carolina to give somebody a disclosure telling them how agency works, in most cases at what we call first substantial contact. So before I even explain to you what that is, picture that if you don't know all these rules that I'm about to teach you today, and you get your license and you're a broker, and you start showing people homes, who do they think you work for? Them.
Seller.
No. People don't understand this dynamic. Nobody knows this history lesson that I just gave you. All they know is there's agents out there. So if somebody finds you on Zillow and calls you and say, show me a pretty house, they're probably assuming that you're working for them. But we still have sole seller representation. We have buyer representation now. We have dual agency now, right? There's so many different options. You could be representing the seller and assisting them. You could be representing them and assisting them. You could be representing both simultaneously. Now, in North Carolina, those are your only options. In other states, they have what's called transactional brokerage. We talked about that word. We don't have that here, but in transactional brokerage, you represent no one. Nobody. See how agency can get a little squirrely real quick? So this is just going off of what I said. Firms and brokers owe their loyalty to the client who is employing them. Very often, payments come from other places than the people who employ them. Does not change our loyalties. When I work with a buyer, my loyalties are to the buyer, right? If I'm a buyer's agent. More often than not, I get paid from the seller and or the seller's agent. Never changed my loyalties though. That's just the way that we work most of the time. P, I'll tell you the good thing about learning a new language. The more we talk this new language, the more you understand. If I shipped you off to Spain right now, you'd be speaking Spanish in 3 months, girl. So we're just going to keep speaking that language until you get it, right? So, now that I've laid the foundation... Always ask questions. Yes, for sure.
How does somebody become a transactional broker?
They go to a state that has transactional brokerage. If you're asking for like a better answer as in like why, I'm not sure. And that was one of the things that blew my mind about that Colorado. They have it there. We don't. I'm not sure why states elect to do that, right? Like why we would say, well, we're just going to facilitate this, but we're not actually looking out for anybody. It's just very foreign to me because I was licensed in North Carolina, which is another reason why I'm trying to expand my knowledge because I hate not knowing the nuances from state to state. But let me give you an example, just so we can all be on the same page. Do you think there are times that a seller may find their own buyer? Sure, right? Some people do. Well, they don't necessarily need representation because they've already worked out the details. But do you think that some people probably don't even know where to start paperwork-wise in order to convey real property adequately? So in some states, if you find your own buyer to save money, you may just negotiate with a broker to be a transactional or facilitating broker. Say, I'll give you $1,000 to make sure this paperwork-ish is right. No loyalties to anybody. They're not going to help the buyer. They're not going to help the seller. They're just making sure everybody has the paperwork and things are done legally and correctly. Does that make sense? Yeah. What you got, Conrad?
So, photographing a house for a real estate agent from Rex Homes, REX, and they were like in Texas. And I guess the seller or the owner of the house found this company and they advertised that they would take less commission or something and they wouldn't, it would save the seller money. But they were in Texas and they hired me to photograph the house and then they represented the seller from Texas here in North Carolina.
Yeah. So this is outside of the scope of the class, but just understand that you can have a licensed entity in Texas and then get a license for it in North Carolina as well, so long as you have a qualifying broker in North Carolina. And it would have a firm license. If you've ever seen Open Door had to get a brokerage license. They're based out of Colorado or somewhere like that. So it does happen, but do understand that they would have to have somebody here to be the office BIC of the North Carolina location. So they would be based in Texas, but they would have had a home base here. You just probably didn't work with them.
To me, that kind of seemed like a transitional brokerage because how could the Texas real estate agent represent the property properly? They were just pushing paperwork, basically.
Yeah, here's what that is called. That is called limited service brokerage. And we're going to talk about that a little bit because it gets a little bit slippery. And the reason being, when we are talking about North Carolina and being a licensee in North Carolina, you are bound by all license on commission rules. So even if you elect to be what's called a limited service broker, where basically you're just doing a couple things, but you're not adequately representing somebody, you can still be in big trouble for not doing your fiduciary duties or following license on commission rules, like providing disclosures, like providing ARP codes, like presenting offers. You know, there's things you can get in trouble for. That's just called limited service brokerage, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. Pia, correct. For the test, transactional brokerage is not in North Carolina. You will see the only way that you may see it in North Carolina is which of the following is not legal in North Carolina, and it may say transactional brokerage. We don't practice that in any way, shape, or form. There you go. North Carolina is a fiduciary state. Remember, we practice fiduciary brokerage, meaning loyalties to somebody always. We have to have somebody we're loyal to. It's either the buyer or the seller or both. Okay? If we're not loyal to anybody, we're not in it. I want to go back to Lisa. She said, then what was the point of the federal level getting involved in brokerage, you mean?
Yeah, I had a brain moment. Yeah, the feds getting involved if they said, well, the buyers aren't being represented, and then there's the paper pushers of just the transactional brokers. What is the point?
Well, the point was first and foremost that we created buyer agencies, so now buyers had representation, so they could be represented. The other point was, Lisa, every state has an agency disclosure. Every state. So they basically outlined, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a second, that every single one of you has to tell the public how these relationships work. They have to know who you're representing from the offset. It can't be a surprise to them. If you're working for the seller, you have to tell them you work for the seller. If you're working for them, you have to tell them. That's what the feds came in and did. They said, fix it, and the way that we fix it is everybody agreed to have an agency disclosure and buyer agency was created. And so we just would outline, because historically nobody could represent the buyer. But now that we have buyer agency, you could represent the buyer, you could represent the seller. You have to tell people who you represent. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that's a question I had as well, where, do you have to do like the cops have to do? If you're representing the buyer and then somebody's interested in the property, before you get into personal things with the agent
Yes.
that's representing you, they have to disclose, hey, anything you tell me,
Yes.
I have to tell my client.
It is just like the Miranda rights, Lisa. Absolutely. Exactly. It is just like that. Because that's exactly what Lisa's talking about, the Miranda rights. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You know what we say? Almost verbatim, anything you say can and will be used against you in a real estate transaction. That's exactly right. And that is called the agency disclosure. It is our version of the Miranda rights. We're going to talk about it. That's excellent. That's right. So, let me explain something. Up until now, I've been talking about whom we represent or do not represent. You agree? I've been talking about buyer's agents who represent buyers. I've been talking about seller's agents that represent sellers. Listing agents that represent sellers. Selling agents who could represent either. So I've been talking about who we were working for, but I want to change gears and I want to talk about what power of authority they have. Because there's a lot of different agents out there. Remember, an agent is just somebody working on behalf of somebody else. So, we like to call these power levels or sometimes tiers of authority. Please do not get confused. These have nothing to do with whom you represent. This only has to do with what you can do on behalf of them. Does that statement make sense? Now, I will give you examples of each, but that's not saying that this is the only time it can happen. So let's start with the first one. It is called a special agent. Okay, a special agent. I don't care how you remember this, right? You can be the 007 of real estate, or you can ride the short bus to show houses. You are a special agent when you are working with buyers and sellers. Special. And let me explain what special agency is. This is the lowest tier of power, the lowest tier of authority. You are hired to do a very specific task, like help somebody buy and sell a home. That's it. That's all you can do. And when I say help, I mean assist. So you can give them advice and you can market a home. But understand, when you are a special agent, you have no authority to make decisions. Only your boss can do that, and your boss is your client. Picture it this way. Would you want to list your house for sale and then your agent have the authority to take whichever offer they thought was best for you? Meaning they didn't have to consult you. An offer came in and they could just be like, oh, I put you under contract. You're taking this. You think that would be something that would make sense?
No.
Not at all, right? So you are literally an advisor if you are a special agent. You're hired to do a very specific task and you are limited to that task. For us, that task is assisting in buying, assisting in selling. No decisions can be made by us. Only your client can make decisions. Think back to that obedience, right? I told you that if I did something called a CMA, comparative market analysis, for my client, and I decided we should list their house for $400,000, and they say, no, Seth, I want to list it for $700,000. They're the boss. I have to follow their lawful, willful instructions. I can't go against what they said and list it for $400,000. They are the decision makers. We're the advisors. There you go. I like that, Tia. Speak, but not act. We can say all kinds of stuff, but we can't bind them to anything. We can't do anything without their permission, and nothing can happen without them saying so. Absolutely. Everybody understand this? Now, let me tell you the most common time that you are a special agent. Buyers and sellers. Most transactions, you are a special agent. When you help somebody buy a home, you're a special agent. When you help somebody sell a home, you're a special agent. Okay? Special, special, special. So let's talk about the next tier up, okay? One level up, we've got what we call a general agent. A general agent, okay? A general agent has more powers and more authorities than a special agent. Meaning, we have given our agent some authority to make decisions on our behalf. Let me give you two exceptionally common examples. One is a property manager. Picture this. If I say property management agreement, who are the parties to a property management agreement? Think about it for a second.
Property manager, the tenant.
Not the tenant.
The owner of that community.
The owner. Yeah, there you go. And understand it doesn't have to be a community, but that would be an example, right? You could be the property manager of a single family detached home. So it's the owner of real property and the broker. Everybody agree? Those would be the parties to a property management agreement. The reason why I'm emphasizing this, folks, is the relationships that each type of agreement creates is highly testable. So if we say property management agreement, what relation does it create? Well, it creates one between a property owner and a broker. And so when we're dealing with property management agreements, it typically gives the property manager broker certain authorities, like the ability to sign leases on behalf of the property owner. They may just say, as long as I get this much a month, you get to pick and choose. And so we could sign it. We could bind them to leases. They may give us the authority to evict tenants for unpaid rents. They may give us the authority to order repairs on their behalf. A lot of times there's what we call an NTE, right? Not to exceed amount. But you see the difference. I can bind them to things, right? I can bind them to leases. I can bind them to, eviction proceedings. I can bind them to repair invoices because they've given me the authority to do so. This is a general agent. Well, let me give you another example of a general agent. When we've been talking about agency relationships, who did I say the agent was?
The firm.
The firm. And so all of you fine folks are eventually going to get a license and you're going to go affiliate with a firm or brokerage or office. We can use a couple words here. And when you do, you are a subagent of the firm. We've talked about this. Well, even though you're a subagent of your firm, you're actually also considered a general agent of your firm. And let me explain why. A firm is an entity, right? It's just this concept. Well, when we go out and we meet clients, sellers and buyers or whoever, if it's a seller, we'll sign a listing agreement. If it's a buyer, we'll sign a buyer agency agreement. Even though the firm is the agent, the individual licensee is the one who signs the agreement. Well, that means that if Gene signed an agreement with a buyer, and Gene works for ABC Realty, he just bound ABC Realty to be the agent of this buyer. You see how he has the authority to bind somebody to something. It just happens to be a firm, not a buyer or a seller, right? He is a general agent of his firm, but he would be a special agent of that buyer. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is that going to be on the test?
Absolutely. This is highly testable. Not so much in the same question, Eric, right? They're not going to say verbatim what I just said. You know, could you be a general agent and a special agent simultaneously? They're not going to do that, but they're going to make sure you know what special agency is and your tiers of authority for as a special agent. They may ask you what an example of a special agent is, right? Like working with buyers and sellers. They may ask you what you can do as a general agent and what an example of general agency is, like working as a property manager or working with a real estate firm. Everybody with me? So let's take it one step further, okay? There's one more tier of power, and that is a universal agent. Now let me help you out with something. Folks, how big is the universe?
Very large.
Infinite, presumably? Well, so is the powers that a universal agent has. A universal agent could do anything and everything on behalf of a person. So Britney Spears was a great example because in her conservatorship, she did not have her own say. Her father could make all decisions on behalf of her. That'd be a universal agent. And a lot of times when I teach this, somebody's like a power of attorney? Not even. Because even a power of attorney has different tiers. You can have just medical power of attorney. You could have just financial power of attorney. This would be a full power of attorney, meaning you can do anything and everything, or a conservatorship guardian. Do you think this is a type of power that we ever need as real estate brokers? I don't want it. Just asking for, liabilities, right? Yeah, it's kind of like that, right? Like a full-fledged guardian who can make all decisions on behalf of you. That's what this is. A universal agent could open bank accounts in your name. They could start businesses in your name. They could close businesses in your name. They could pull the plug on you. They can do everything. Now, please understand that because of this scope of power and the ability to do anything and everything, you can really only have one universal agent at a time. Could you have multiple general agents, multiple special agents? Absolutely. But a universal agent, you could only typically have one at a time. Brittany, that sounds like terrible life advice. You're saying that this person could do that. Is that what you're saying? So you got to put that in there, Brittany, because I thought you were just telling everybody to put their kids up for adoption, right? Put your kids up for adoption. Go on vacation. Woo! I was so confused. Yeah. So this is unlimited power. Okay, they can do anything and everything. Now, this is just going with what I said. Limited power of attorney. There are certain times where we may have just signatory authority on behalf of a certain document. So we never would want to have full power of attorney or unlimited, universal agency or anything like that. But there are certain documents that we may get permission, with caution, to sign on behalf of our clients because maybe they're not going to be able to attend closing. Most often, the only document we're signing, though, is what we call the ALTA, which is the American Land and Title Association, funding statement, which just talks about the costs and the final proceeds and stuff like that. In this agency, the agent could put your children. Yeah. Okay, you were just clarifying. Malvina says, so brokers are general or special agents? Yes. That's not what you're asking. Is it which one? It could be either. You could be a special agent if you're working with a buyer and seller. You could be a general agent if you're working with a property manager or being on behalf of your firm. Remember what I told you. These tiers of power have nothing to do with whom you represent, just the power of authority you have when you represent them. I just merely gave you a couple examples. There you go. That's right, Tia. Always adult diapers. I'm like super disappointed because my desk, like all my normal stuff, I had to like get it off my desk for taking the test the other, and like my chapstick's gone. I'm just like sitting here and just like feeling like a crazy person, like a llama. You know how like them, like just constantly just feel like crazy. What you got, Ann?
Just to confirm that what you just clarified, which is that the agent of the firm would, in this scenario, would have special agency, but the firm itself, you said, was general?
No. Let me clarify. The agent of the firm would be a general agent of the firm. Let me explain, Am. If I work for ABC Realty, I sign an independent contractors agreement that outlines our relationship. And in that, I have the authority to sign listing agreements and buyer agency agreements. Well, ABC Realty would be the agent, but I can sign a document and bind them to it. So me as the licensee, I am a general agent of my firm. But for clarity, when I sign a buyer agency agreement, I'm also a special agent of the buyer.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So we're talking about the individual licensee, right? Not so much the firm. If you want to get technical, the firm would also be a special agent of the buyer, just like we are, because the firm is the agent. But when we are talking about our relationship with a brokerage firm, we are a general agent of our brokerage firm because they've given us authority to bind them to agency contracts. Yeah. So I'm not going to take this into, a little quiz thing, but I'll ask the question, okay? Deb has been hired to represent the seller in a real estate transaction. Deb has been given the power to handle all negotiations, communications, and agreements so long as she gets approval of the seller on decisions. What type of relationship do you think she has here?
Special.
There you go. We're doing stuff to help buy, doing stuff to help sell, but the ultimate decision has to come from our person. That's special agency. We're not making any decisions, so it can't be anything else, right? We already talked about this. I'm not going to go into detail. Remember North Carolina, fiduciary brokerage. We just talked about that. Transactional brokerage is in some other states, so you will see it on the national portion. The only time you'll see it in North Carolina is, which of the following is not allowed? Transactional brokerage, right? We have to represent somebody. Now, let me go down one other rabbit hole, if you will. And this is an important rabbit hole, otherwise I wouldn't go down it, okay? This says the vast majority of written agency agreements are exclusive agreements. This means that the client has promised to only work with and compensate one firm. So when we get into this word exclusive, I always try to warn you because you'll find that I will use it in a couple different scenarios. What does the word exclusive mean?
One and only.
One and only. I like that. One and only. Only. Right? So when we're talking about an exclusive buyer agency agreement, we mean that they've agreed that they can't work with any other buyer agent but us. Does that make sense? We're their person, right? That goes back to us being in a relationship. It's official, right? But you'll find that whenever I get into some deeper representation comments about us representing them, there are times that we are giving them exclusive representation as well. So you'll hear the word in two different ways. And I just want to caution you of that. And I'll always try to provide some clarity on which type of exclusive I'm talking about. Them to us or us to them. So when we're talking about agency agreements being exclusive, that means them to us. Okay? Them to us. Everybody understand that? So this last piece is, this is like a marriage. The client is committed to the firm for that particular transaction. Yeah. We would be in a relationship. And we're bound to each other. And they can't get out of it without a hell of a lot of paperwork, just like a marriage, right?
How long are these contracts good for? Like, if you don't like your agent, like you've been assigned, okay, so, let me reword that. If you don't like the broker that the agent has assigned, and at that point you don't like the agent, and you want to change agencies, what is...
Sucks to suck.
What?
Sucks to suck.
So you just stuck.
They can mutually agree. That's one of the ways.
Yeah. Now here's the thing. Eric's right. When I say this, there are ways to get out of it. We're just not there yet, Lisa. But let me just use a very specific word. Contract.
Yeah.
If you sign a 2-year contract with your gym, can you just walk away on day 3?
Penalties, probably.
Yeah, you'd be in breach of contract, and the penalties can be severe. So there's your answer. Can you get out of it? Yeah, with lots of penalties, because it's a contract.
Even if you're a buyer?
Yeah, it's a contract. Picture this, Lisa, and that's why I'm giving you the gym. Do you think you can just be like, I don't like this gym, so I want out, and they honor that? No, right? Answer the question, Lisa. Would your gym let you out of their contract if you say, I don't like this gym?
Well, I did do that with the gym, so yeah, they let me out.
How about a 3-year contract with a job?
Yeah.
Could you just get out of it by saying, I don't like it?
No, I mean, there was.
Lisa, say no.
No.
No. You can't get out of a contract just by saying, I don't like it. And so if you have a buyer agency contract, you can't just be like, I don't like my agent or my firm. I want out. It doesn't work that way.
Return a car. You can't, in the state of North Carolina, you cannot return a car after you drive it off the lot. Did you know that?
Well, Lisa, technically, some places give you 3 days to do that. So you've just put an exception to that one as well. You have to understand, there's ways to do everything, but not without penalties. The point is, you can't just get out of it. Can you get out of it with some legal headache? Yes. Can you get out of it with some penalties? Yes. But you can't just be like, I want out. And then, Lisa, are you married? Yeah. So if your husband came up to you and say, I want out, you'll say, over my dead body, right? Marriage is a contract. You agree? In the state of North Carolina, you have to be separated for a year before you can even get divorced. Can you get out of your marriage? Yes. But is it a pain in the tuchus? Yes. Does that make sense? Don't be thinking about your gym membership, Lisa. That's not the real world, okay? You're stuck. When you sign a contract, you are stuck, girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how you need to approach these things from a testable point of view. A contract is a contract is a contract. There you go, Marquita. Where were you 5 minutes ago, Marquita? You should have just chimed in. Yeah, an apartment lease. You can't be like, I don't like it here anymore. I'm just going to go live somewhere else. You can't do that. What are they going to do? They're going to take your security deposit and maybe go after you for unpaid rents. Can you walk away? Yeah, good luck in court. Come on, Marquita. That was so helpful. Sometimes I just get so caught. Bless. Should have just chimed in. You just let me go off on these tangents about gym memberships. Lisa's would have been helpful. Brittany says the penalty is us releasing their confidential information to others' customers because they're a customer now. Well, yes and no. There's worse penalties than that, as you'll find. There are worse penalties than that. There you go, Sarah. Broker lease. and moved last weekend. They kept their $1,300 deposit and penalized you 2 months rent. There you go. Point made. Love it. Where were y'all 5 seconds? Dang it.
But they can't assign another broker to you if you don't like that broker. Your contract is with the agency, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Right, because if you, let's say that you are with ABC and Shelby's your agent and you hate Shelby's guts, right? Could you go, in theory, to the firm and be like, Shelby's a bitch, right? And I don't want to work with her. And they'd be like, okay, well, now you're working with Ann. Hope you like Ann better. Sure, that could happen because technically the relationship was always with ABC. A lot of times the question gets asked, right? Everybody always is like, well, what about Shelby? She's the one who actually found Lisa. Is she going to get paid? That's up to the firm, right? Most likely, yes. Because we're not just going to like screw Shelby just because, you know, Lisa's crazy and doesn't like Shelby, right? Like we're going to be like, well, Ann and Shelby will split it 50-50, but she'll just work with Ann or something like that. So the biggest thing that I can warn you is don't get caught up on money when we're talking about these because the questions are never going to be about, well, how do you get paid? They're not, right? Trust me, there's ways to get paid, but that's not what they're going to ask you. They're going to ask you about what legally happens. Are you under contract? Can you get out? Can you this? Can you that? Yeah, there you go. Marquita said, broke my lease, gave 30-day notice, and the reason for leaving, got my full deposit, and didn't get any penalties. And CJ is right. Leasing agent with a heart is exceptionally rare, right? They don't. But you know what? I imagine there's so many people, like, I mean, in this class alone, we got like 3 people who just admitted to breaking their lease. Do you think it's easy to be a leasing agent? You people make them crazy, right? That's got to be, yeah.
It's very difficult to be the lease consultant and the manager. Those are very tough jobs, so it's fun.
Look, I can see a lot of you on the screen at one point. Jeff feels very strongly about this, right? Like Jeff is doing leasing, and Jeff is like, he literally said, when I said, you people make them crazy, he said, you do, and then he screamed. Like, he didn't, like, I'm assuming there's nobody else around him, because Jeff actually screamed. I could tell that there was real sound coming out on the screen whenever he did that. So yeah, you got to understand, right? Makes people crazy. So I get it, right? I get them not having a heart. They have to like turn into Elsa, right? Frozen heart and all that stuff because it's a nutty job out there. Here's the deal. It is 10:28, so as opposed to going any further, I'm gonna be nice to you. Let you go ahead and take a break, okay? 10:30 to 10:40. Y'all go take a break, stretch, get some coffee, get your minds right, because we got lots of fun-filled stuff to catch up on today, because we got to get through 3.4 and get a lot of into 3.5 today as well. So, y'all have a break. I will see you back at 10:40. Alrighty, 10:40. Work your way back, get your cameras back on. Let's keep going with this fun-filled agency discussion. Let me take a moment and show you something back on the syllabus as we are looking at this slide as well. So, let me ask you a couple questions as I pull this up, okay? Do you think, right, now with just some of the foundational concepts that we've talked about with agency, Do you think that there could be a real estate brokerage firm that elected to only work with sellers?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure. Do you think there could be a real estate brokerage firm that elected to only work with buyers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Do you think there's a good number of real estate brokerage firms that elect to work with both?
Yes.
Yes. Now, the reason why I'm asking you these questions, I want to show you something. This says it's up. There we go. When we get into this, I like to come back to this syllabus because I told you that I can never, ever, ever see the North Carolina State licensing exam. It's just not on the cards. I'm not, until I get them to give me a copy, right? I can't see it. So the same lady that I've made ill on several occasions about the inability to see the test, every time I ask her, I've told you, what she tells me is, if it's in the syllabus, it could be on the test. And so I want to go to the agency section, and I just want to have a discussion with you about what's in the syllabus for a second before I continue on with the slides. When we're talking about brokerage relationships, we've already established that somebody could be working with a brokerage firm or a sole proprietor. And we're going to get into that distinction a little bit more in the future because that relationship matters for certain agency agreements, especially. But here's what I want to show you, which kind of correlates with that slide. Here's where we just talked about universal agent, general agent, special agent. But if you are looking at creation of agency relationships, I want you to understand that these agreements all exist, and we have these different types of agreements that are very specific in what they do. Like buyer agency agreement makes a relationship with the buyer. Listing agreement makes a relationship with the seller. Dual agency agreement would make you have a relationship with both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. But when you look about here, it gives you some outlines of how this all works. So here's where I told you, consumer could employ a sole practitioner. Independent broker can function as a sole proprietor or as a licensed entity. It's possible for you to be both, right? An entity with one person, a sole proprietor, without an entity. Because by definition, sole proprietor means we don't have an entity. And then in that case, with a sole proprietor, an agency agreement would be between sole proprietor's company and the consumer. But when we're dealing with brokerages, here's where I want to provide some clarity because of the way that they articulate single agency. So I just want to spend a second here. So if we were talking about single agency, meaning seller agency only, think of a firm that only works with sellers. The company would only represent property owners, all affiliated brokers who work for this company, and all seller clients of the company, would represent all seller clients of the company and seller subagents, right? So understand that if I was talking about a firm like this, you folks all get, at this point, I'm hoping, that they could never represent a buyer, right? But could they assist a buyer?
Yes.
Yes. But their loyalties would always be to their sellers. So when we say all potential buyers are shown any of the company's listed properties by any affiliated brokers as unrepresented third parties, that tells you if we were looking at a firm that only worked with sellers, yes, they could assist buyers, but they would never have any loyalties to those buyers. Everybody good with that statement? Well, this note right here says, beware of illegal undisclosed dual agency through careless actions of brokers. This goes back to implied. If you thought that you had loyalties to the buyer in a firm like that and you started assisting the buyer, then you're doing what we call undisclosed dual agency and you've breached your fiduciary duties to your seller. You agree? So then when we look at single agency for buyer agency only, right? Let's think back to a firm that only represents buyers. There would be no listings within that firm because there are no sellers that they represent. All affiliated brokers represent all buyer clients of the company as buyer agents, so that sub-agency thing still applies. When we work with one buyer, everybody in the firm is representing the well-being of that buyer. And all of the brokers of a firm that only works with buyers would show properties listed with cooperating companies, meaning companies that do have listings, or with for sale by owners. That statement, everybody good with that too? Well, while that does happen, and you need to know that for test-taking purposes, really and truthfully, it's not too dissimilar than what the normal relationship is, except there's one less option for those things that we just talked about. So the most common thing is a brokerage firm that represents both buyers and sellers and cooperating with other brokerages. So when we say that ABC Realty has a buyer, it really works the same as single buyer agency because we're only representing the well-being of that buyer. We can all agree that people buy and sell homes all day, every day that have nothing to do with each other. You agree? So you just got to be very careful when you're reading and interpreting scenarios, because even if we're talking about a firm that works with both buyers and sellers, if Brittany called me up and I worked for ABC Realty, and ABC Realty does work with buyers and sellers, Brittany calls me up and I agree to be Brittany's buyer's agent. Even though we work with sellers, can we all agree that I'm only looking out for Brittany's best interest in that relationship? Well, here's a very early epiphany to have. Even though it's me, and I work for ABC Realty, Brittany hired me to be her buyer's agent. Who is actually Brittany's agent?
The firm.
ABC. So now picture this. Lynette hires ABC Realty to list her home because my firm does both. And Brittany wants to put an offer on Lynette's home. Think about it for a second. We work with buyers and sellers all the time, and there's never a conflict of interest in most cases. But now, ABC has loyalties to Brittany, who wants to buy Lynette's house. ABC also has loyalties to Lynette, who wants to sell her house. That's dual agency. So foundationally speaking, if we have a firm that only works with sellers, dual agency can never arise. If we have a firm that only works with buyers, dual agency can never arise. But once we have a firm that works with both buyers and sellers, dual agency can arise. But let me make one other thing clear. If Brittany only ever wanted to see listings that were listed by another firm, right? We're ABC. And instead of Lynette's house, who's also with ABC, she wanted to see a listing by XYZ, PPQ, right? Keller Williams. You can never have dual agency in what we call cooperating brokerage. The word cooperating brokerage means two different firms cooperating together to get the deal to close. We're not on the same team, but we are going to work together to get an end outcome. Does that make sense? So these are all highly testable and very important concepts. And you always have to analyze a lot of different pieces in a test question. Does the firm work with both? Right? If they don't, the answer is different. If they do, certain things have to be present. Because we can all agree, and this is the last piece before I go back to the slides, that even if we had Lynette and Brittany, both represented by ABC, so long as a buyer from ABC doesn't want to see Lynette's house, dual agency never arises. And so long as Brittany never wants to see a listing that our firm has, dual agency never arises. It would be what I call, and here's where I'm using this word for us, what we call exclusive representation for them. Because I told you when we sign an agency contract, we're saying they're exclusive to us. They can't use anybody else. But when I'm talking about these relationships, now I'm saying there's a lot of relationships where we're exclusively representing them. We're only looking out for them and their best interest. And the only time that changes in North Carolina is dual agency. Because a firm that works with buyers and sellers, it's still exclusive representation for the seller, exclusive representation for the buyer, looking out for the best interests of both. Because they have nothing to do with each other unless they're in the same deal. Does that make sense? What you got, Ann?
I'm following everything that you just said, but I'm just trying to make sense of it in the context of this syllabus on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So for C, agency relationships when two companies cooperate, when they list these bullets out, can you connect that back to what you were just saying? Like when they write exclusive agency, what are they trying to get us to?
This is exactly what I just said. So if you think back, so when two companies, let me just put this on the screen here. If we've got ABC and I have Brittany, and then let me change it, okay? Let's say Lynette is represented by XYZ because we're talking about two different companies.
Yep.
And I'm going to make you an agent of XYZ, and you have Lynette. Okay? I'm just abbreviating your names for convenience. So I would sign, if she was the buyer and she was the seller, I would sign a buyer agency agreement with Brittany. And I am giving her exclusive representation. ABC loyalties in the relationship with Brittany are solely to Brittany, right? Well, and you sign a listing agreement with Lynette. And XYZ's loyalties in regard to Lynette are solely to Lynette. There's no conflict of interest because we're separate teams, separate firms, separate brokerages. And so when we cooperate together, you're giving Lynette exclusive seller agency, I'm giving Brittany exclusive buyer agency. Dual agency could never arise in this scenario because we're separate firms, separate teams. So that's what this is talking about. But when I've used the terminology seller sub-agency, we're going to talk about this in just a minute. This gets very interesting. Okay? So we're not there yet. All I want you to understand is that if the other side of the deal, can we think back to a sales transaction? Okay? Buyer and seller. Two sides to the deal. If somebody is with another firm, our loyalties to our person are exclusive. We have zero conflict of interest. That's what we're getting at here. But the second that we're dealing with two people in the same transaction, in the same firm, we're not giving anybody exclusive representation anymore. We're loyal to both. And that's what dual agency is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I guess I was also just trying to figure out like what they were trying to get at with these bullets underneath, like seller sub agency.
We're not there yet. So I basically took us here and stopped. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Seller sub-agency we're going to talk about because I do think that you will see that on the North Carolina side because we have very specific rules on this. So I just wanted to lay this foundational information out for you and help you understand that when you're looking at a test question, you have to be exceptionally careful with words like cooperating brokers. Cooperating means two firms, right? Dual agency means one firm. In-house transaction means one firm. Customer means somebody we don't have loyalties to. Client means we do. Principal means we do. Buyer agent, selling agent, different things. Listing agent, seller's agent, same thing. So there's so many nuances and things that you have to look for that could absolutely change the entirety of the question in these relationships. Everybody with me so far? Patrick says, from the firm's perspective, isn't dual agency similar to transactional brokerage in some ways? Yeah, and I alluded to that last week, right? Because if you owe loyalties to nobody, you're just going to see what happens. Well, if you owe loyalties to both, you're basically just going to see what happens. You can't give advice if you're representing both parties. Doesn't make sense. Because how would that benefit them? In dual agency, you cannot have an exclusive buyer agent and an exclusive seller agent. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. You've got to be careful of what context exclusive is being used. When we're talking about you representing them, if ABC owes loyalties to, who did I just use? Lynette, and loyalties to Brittany, neither one of them have exclusive representation. They've got shared representation. Patrick says, would you never have the same broker, meaning the sub-agent, working in a dual agency relationship representing both seller and buyer, or is it dual agency only at the firm agent level? Hang tight on that. Okay, let's get back into this. Hang tight, because I just wanted to give you a little foundational information directly from the syllabus before I get into all of this jazz. Okay? So, when we're talking about these relationships in sales, this is what you would think of as kind of the menu. And this is important when we get into the disclosure, because when I teach you the agency disclosure and the agency disclosure rule, we think of it as presenting somebody with a menu of options, right? When you go to a restaurant, we give you a menu, we say, here's what we have available. And then we would ask you to choose. So let me keep going, and we're going to talk about these all in great detail. We've already talked about the flow. Client or principal hires the firm, and then the agent of the firm represents, the firm is the agent who represents the client, and then everybody is a sub-agent. And that's important to understand, especially when we get into these dual agency pieces. If you think back to brokerages as teams, anytime anybody is watching any sports teams, and they're different, one is trying to win, the other is trying to win. Real estate's no different. Buyer's agent's trying to win for the buyer. Listing agent's trying to win for the seller. You've got to think of it that way. It's not just, oh, well, we all want to get to a sale. Yeah, we do. But when you have loyalties and fiduciary duties to somebody, you want to put your client in the best possible scenario. I asked a question last week, I believe, to Eric. If I made you pay $6 million on a home that I could help you get for $200,000, did I do my job right? The answer is no. Lisa says, so wouldn't recommend they get a different broker for their best interest. No, and it'll make more sense in a second. I'm teasing you with some information. It's going to get better. Hang tight. So we're talking about these transactions, right? Seller wants to make the most money. Buyer wants the best deal. It is a tug of war. What works well for a seller is not in the best interest of the buyer, and vice versa. It's not. So you're always thinking about the loyalties and this dynamic and how these things are going to play out. So let's keep going. I'm going to enlighten you. We're not even going to talk about this. If you don't get this by now, then I'm not even acknowledging that this slide exists, because I'm just still too butthurt about it. Some of y'all just ruined my day when I showed you this, so I'm just going to, right, there we go. Just pass on by it. Okay? So here's where we're getting into it. Exclusive seller agency. Well, what we mean is that the seller has representation with zero conflict of interest. So the most common way to think of this is the firm scenario. You all understand that if a firm never works with anybody other than sellers, that the seller would always be completely and utterly represented by that firm. No ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts. But even in a firm that has both buyer and seller representation, when we get hired by somebody, we're going to do anything and everything to give them exclusive representation until we can't. So this is that context of exclusive being used differently. When we say an exclusive listing agreement, that means the seller can't work with anybody other than us. But when we're talking about exclusive seller agency, that means we're representing them and their best interest exclusively. I did say butt hurt.
Can you repeat those two different distinctions?
Yeah. If we're talking about an exclusive listing agreement, that is an agreement we would sign with a seller that says they can only work with us. But when I'm talking about exclusive seller agency, I'm talking about a relationship where we're only looking out for their best interest, nobody else's. And that's where I wanted to provide that clarity, because exclusive gets thrown around so much that sometimes you don't realize there's a differentiation there. Let me give you an example. You ever seen the show Sister Wives? I think he just lost all of his wives. I've never watched that personally, but Shelby's like, I watch it all the time. That's just crazy. Here's the thing. Homeboy has, how many wives did he have, Shelby? 4. So in that context, right, they were all loyal to him, but he wasn't, because he had 4 people, right, that he was loyal to. So sometimes it changes, right? Sometimes we expect them to be loyal to us, but we're not going to be necessarily loyal to them. And it depends on the scenario. Because if we sign an exclusive, let me just slowly but surely, let's talk about this, okay? If I sign an exclusive listing agreement with Marquita is selling real property. That exclusive listing agreement says, Marquita, you cannot work with another agent so long as we're in this relationship together, right? We're in a relationship. But I can obviously represent other sellers as well and not be in a conflict with anything that I'm doing for Marquita. Everybody okay with that statement? What other sellers do with their houses do not affect Marquita in any way, shape, or form. But if I'm a firm that works with buyers as well, and I agree to work with Conrad, and I show Conrad 20 different homes from 20 different brokerages, can we all agree that I'm giving Conrad exclusive representation as a buyer and still giving Marquita exclusive representation as a seller? Well, what happens when Conrad wants to see Marquita's house? I promised to look after both of them. So now neither one of them has exclusive representation anymore. They still can't go out and work with another agent, right? So they're still exclusive to me. But now my loyalties are divided. I owe Marquita old car, and I owe Conrad old car. And I'm screwed, because how the hell do you do that? Understand it's completely legal, and I'm going to teach you how you do it.
Designated dual agency.
Well, there you go. There's the answer. And I'll enlighten you on that in the future. But does that make sense for everybody, how this word exclusive changes depending on who we're talking about? And they both had exclusive representation up until the point that arose. But regardless of even them, it now not having exclusive representation, because I have multiple wives, if you will, they still can't leave me to go anywhere else, because our agreement said they had to be exclusive to me. Does that make sense? And it's going to continue to build in your mind as I show you examples of this. I'm just laying foundational information. Lynette says you cannot operate as dual, not giving advice to any one of them. I'm sorry, you can operate as dual, not giving advice to any of them. Correct. Absolutely. What you got, Ann?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that slide because I have the slides printed and I was looking at. So when it says exclusive seller agency and then single agency in parentheses, there can be exclusive seller agency, but not just single agency, right? Because I think maybe I'm not understanding the term, because if I understand exclusive seller agency to mean that my allegiance to I'm solely loyal to my seller client, couldn't there be, like, the buyer has their own agent and they have an exclusive buyer agency from like a different firm, right?
Yes, and so I do want to provide clarity because sometimes these slides contradict certain logical things, and I want to explain because Ann's right. So if we're looking at this slide and we're talking about exclusive seller agency, our firm represents the best interests of the seller only. Okay, that's it. And so this does say that the buyer is unrepresented, meaning they're a customer. But folks, remember what I told you last week. Represented by somebody else is also a customer. Please don't let this word trip you up. The buyer, if I was, ABC, the buyer is getting exclusive representation from ABC. We don't really care about this person. They could be unrepresented or they could be with XYZ. Either way, we don't give a shit because we're not loyal to them. So they're a customer regardless. The better word here is customer. Is that what you were looking for, Ann? Because...
Yeah. Well, the slide that I have printed after it says exclusive seller agency at the top, it says in parentheses single agency. And I don't know why this one doesn't say that, but maybe that's confusing me and it doesn't need to. I guess I'm just trying to understand what it's getting at, which is I understand the meaning of the word exclusive seller agency, that we're not focused on the buyer if the seller is our client.
Correct.
And I guess I'm just trying to understand that this slide is pointing out that can happen in different types of transactions. Like if there's
hang tight. Sometimes we just got to get through the question. I've got to understand the question you're asking, and sometimes I know it's very hard to articulate because this is a very confusing concept. Let me just make sure. Let me see if these are the slides you are looking at, and I can provide some clarity, folks. When I'm telling you, that's why I showed you the syllabus first. Single agency means only one party is represented. The most common example that you can think of is a firm that only works with one or the other, but it doesn't have to mean that. It means only one party is represented. And I want to show you, do you mean...
Yeah, I think that's what's confusing me. I think it's right after that slide. Go on.
This one.
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just as a firm that only works with sellers. It would be impossible for us to have a relationship with that buyer. That is all this is saying. It would be impossible. It could not arise. This is the extreme one side. But understand, folks, if I am a firm, ABC Realty, that only works with sellers, I could show the house to a buyer, but that buyer would be unrepresented because I only work with unrepresented buyers. If they had somebody else, right, I wouldn't be assisting them. I wouldn't be doing anything for them because somebody else would be responsible for looking after them. But please understand, from a relationship point of view, my loyalties and my interests lie solely with the seller. I really could care less if this person is unrepresented or has an agent. They're a customer either way, and I'm not looking out for them either way. Does that statement make sense?
Yes. Okay. I think maybe I can articulate it a little bit better. So this slide is speaking to exclusive seller agency, where you have this firm that theoretically only represents sellers.
Yeah.
Right. Then there's a different term that you just used, exclusive seller agent. Could that be in a cooperating? What was the term? Cooperating brokerage, where you have two different firms. Aren't you the exclusive seller and agent?
Yeah. And before I answer that question, and I want to make something abundantly clear for everybody. Most firms work with buyers and sellers. The
Right.
only reason we had to put this in is so you can understand that some firms may not. So could they ask you a question about a firm that only represents sellers, and you have to know that they could assist a buyer, but their loyalties would be to a seller. They would assist an unrepresented buyer, right? Because if my firm only works with sellers and I'm listing a home and you are an unrepresented buyer and you call me, wouldn't I show you the home to try to get it sold for my seller? But I have no loyalties to you. I'm not looking out for you. You are a customer. It would be impossible for you to be anything other than unrepresented in that relationship, because if you were working with a cooperating brokerage firm, I'd say, well, tell your agent to show it. Does that make sense? So the only thing you have to understand is that this could exist. A firm that only works with sellers, a firm that only works with buyers. But in most relationships, you're dealing with a firm that works with both. And even in a firm that works with both, somebody could still have exclusive representation because a conflict of interest could never arise so long as they only wanted to see, a buyer only wanted to see listings that were listed by another firm, or a seller only was brought buyers from another firm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the word can kind of speak to this rare situation where there's a firm that only represents sellers,
Yeah.
buyers.
Yeah.
And then but it can also maybe more commonly refers to the practice in a typical transaction where the seller you would have exclusive seller agency relationship because you're only representing your seller's best interest, and you have a different firm there's a different firm representing the buyer.
Right. And so the word single agency is very unique because it's really just talking about only one side has representation, the other does not. In most cases, the other side does have it. They're still a customer. We still have no loyalties to them. They're just represented by a cooperating brokerage firm. So there's no conflict of interest, still exclusive representation, but there's more than one agent, more than one brokerage firm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And I'm glad you asked that. That's why I like to show you those slides, because if you look on the syllabus and it talks about single agency, most firms don't operate that way. But that's the only context that they use it, right? A firm that only represents this, a firm that only represents that. So single is different from exclusive, but they both work the same. It'll make more sense in a second, I promise. You'll just hang tight. What you got?
Know that it's not one of those firms that can do dual agency if the situation there.
Correct.
Just seeing the single agency to let us know, hey, just to clarify, we only do either the seller or the buyer. So that's for us, so we can just visually see.
Yes. Dual agency will never arise in a firm that only works with sellers, a firm that only works with buyers. And the only option for the other party is to be unrepresented. Why? Because we would not. And let me give you one caveat to that. This is why I don't like some of the ways that they articulate things, because I want to show you back really quick. When we're dealing with
the single agent, the word right there, like she was pointing out, the single agency on the slide, that's not going to be there if it is a firm that can do both.
Correct. Never.
They're just simply putting it there, letting us know they only do it one way.
Right. If you look at the syllabus and it says, and this is why I don't really like, this material came from the Real Estate Commission, and I agree that it's kind of confusing, because in single agency for sellers, the company only represents property owners, no one else. Could they be assisting a buyer, right? Yeah. All potential buyers are shown our listings, but they are unrepresented third parties, they're customers. Because we're talking about just one firm. The reason why I don't like this, because it gets confusing, is because when they switch to buyer agency only, well, they actually reference showing properties with cooperating companies, which means they're actually talking about cooperating brokerage when they're supposed to be talking about single agency. So I think that they probably messed up in these slides, because that really and truthfully shouldn't be referenced. It should only say FSBOs. Otherwise, it's down here, two companies cooperating. So I think that must be, I think that was a mistake on the commission's part. But the only takeaway from this word single agency is if we're talking about a firm that only works with sellers, dual agency will never arise. If we're talking about a firm that only works with buyers, dual agency can never arise. You will never have anything other than exclusive representation for your party. That's it. That is the only representation that will ever happen. You have 100,000% loyalties to them and them only. I don't even normally teach that word, but when it comes up in the slides, I have to, because it's more confusing than them in here certain ways, because they confuse it. They make it so much worse than it needs to be because they're not even testing you on a lot of this stuff. Patrick, I think you had your hand up. Was it you, Patrick? Was it somebody else?
I did. Are you able to go back to slide 118 for a second?
In the learn test pass or in my slides?
Your slides.
Yep.
Sorry.
This one?
I think forward one more. Or, let's see.
Which one is it? Because the numbers may not match up.
Yeah, it's 2 after this slide. Right here.
Oh, right here?
Yeah. So those top 2, exclusive seller agency and exclusive buyer agency, those would both be examples of single agency.
No.
No. Okay.
No.
I'm confused then.
Yeah, okay. Stop for a second. Everybody just sit still for 5 seconds, okay? And let's just talk about this. If I work for ABC Realty and ABC Realty works with sellers and buyers, but Patrick, you hire me to help you buy a home, I am giving you, ABC is giving you exclusive buyer agency. I am representing you in your best interest solely. You agree with that statement?
Yes.
But here's the issue. What if you want to buy a house that is listed by my firm? I can't give you exclusive buyer agency anymore because ABC had loyalties to you, Patrick, and ABC has loyalties to the seller. Exclusive agency just means we have one person we're looking out for. That's it. It can only happen, right? Single agency, this is all that can happen. You will never not have exclusive agency and single agency. But even in a firm that works with sellers and buyers, you start out always with exclusive agency. And you would stay an exclusive agent of the buyer, an exclusive agent of the seller, unless dual agency arises.
Okay. Now, if dual agency arises, let's say you were working for the seller initially, but then a buyer comes and wants to see or wants to be represented by a sub-agent of the firm. Does it ever occur that the seller is resistant to allowing you to enter into a dual agency agreement?
Yes, absolutely. Folks, you're asking the best of questions, and anytime there's confusion, please stop and ask me for clarity. But yet again, I have to warn you, we're putting the cart before the horse because I haven't shown you the agency agreement for dual. I'm just trying to explain foundational concepts of when it's dual, when it's single, when it's exclusive, when exclusive can be used. These are foundational concepts, but yes, there are absolutely times when somebody would give pushback and not allow dual. Yeah, hang tight. What you got, Pia? And then we're going to keep moving forward because we're going to get there, I promise. And if you're still confused at the end of class, I will teach it a million different ways, but I think we'll be good. What you got?
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the slides because I have 118 to this, and you have 120.
I wouldn't worry too much because we have a couple different versions. I mean, I can open the other one and see if it's the one that you have, but I mean, they're just so insignificant in the differences that it's like, please don't panic. I mean, if you see anything that I'm like not talking about or if anything contradicts, I'll help you out. But Travis has two versions of this.
What I'm looking at right now on the screen is exactly what I have on 118.
Okay. Yeah, and that's just where he's edited some. Sometimes he goes back in. Here's the thing. Think about the conversation we just had. When he teaches this class and we have these conversations where he's like, holy crap, that confused the hell out of people. Sometimes he'll come back in and he'll take something out and he'll move it around. And so then I get whatever version, he has. And so your numbers may be different because it may get moved to a different place after feedback from a class. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just pump the brakes on this because I want to move forward, and it's going to make more sense because these are extremely advanced concepts, and this is the trouble that arises. And it's a good thing though, right? So please don't anybody misunderstand. It's a good thing for y'all to be asking all these questions. You just don't have all the information yet. So your questions can't encompass everything. You're not there yet. So which is why I have to table some. So let's make sure that we understand. I'm going to skip forward, okay? When we're dealing with exclusive seller agency, do not think single here, okay? Don't think, throw that word out. That word single is stupid. The only time that single matters is if we're talking about a firm that only represents one or the other. The better word is, for everything else, exclusive. So if I say exclusive seller agency, the firm is only representing the seller in the transaction. Now, I do want to amend this because I don't want you to get confused on test questions. Buyer does not have to be unrepresented. Another firm could be representing them. The word customer could mean an unrepresented person or somebody who we're not representing. Everybody okay with that statement? Because if ABC is exclusively representing the seller and XYZ is representing the buyer, that changes nothing with the fact that our seller is exclusively represented. Do you agree? We're still going to bat for our seller. We don't give two craps about the buyer. I don't care if he's unrepresented. I don't care if he's, represented by somebody who's an idiot. I don't care if he's represented by the best person in the world. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the dynamic of the question in any way, shape, or form. I just know that I don't represent him. My firm doesn't represent him or her. We refer to brokers in these situations as subagents of the seller because the firm is the agent and then you would be a subagent of the seller or the firm, okay?